there isn't a great deal of value in something that benefits the next handful of years at the expense of all future years. And so I think what you have a question of time horizon here. It's, yes, you can save money in the short run, but if it's going to have a real long-term cost to your ability to operate your business, then that's a false economy.
Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I am Merryn Somerset Webb, and this week I am speaking with Tom Slater of Baillie Gifford. He is an investment manager inside the private companies team. He's head of the US equities team, but crucially, I think most of you will know him as the manager of the Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust, which I strongly suspect most listeners hold. And by the way, I also hold. I invited Tom on specifically because I wanted to talk about an essay he's published recently called AI Isn't Coming for Your Job, It's Coming for Your Mind. It's about how AI is reshaping the way we think at a fairly extraordinary speed and what that means for us, for workers in general, for companies, and crucially for society. I mean, it's a really interesting one. We can put in a link, can't we, Tom, at the end so people can read it for themselves as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Okay, great. Anyway, I wasn't supposed to say that. I'm supposed to say, before I start talking to you, I'm supposed to say, Tom, welcome to Merryn Talks Money.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm really interested in this. I can't tell you how much it resonated with me. I mean, normally when we're talking about AI, we talk about the investment. We talk about, is there a data center bubble? We talk about how it's going to take everyone's jobs, and we talk about how it will reshape the economy. And while there are occasional conversations about how it might actually reshape our brains and even our consciousness, that is not people's focus. And actually, the truth is, it's probably the most important thing of all. It's an awful lot more important than the valuations of AI companies and AI adjacent companies, right? What's happening in your head. So let's talk about how you started thinking about that.
Well, I guess it's a topic that is at the top of people's minds at the moment. In one way or another, we're all being affected by this technology, thinking about what it's doing to society, and I guess from books that I'd read, I just started wondering about whether we were focusing on the wrong question. Because, there's this very obvious, are our jobs all going to be automated away by this technology? And, we can get into that. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me, actually, that wasn't the issue. Because it assumed sort of stasis. It assumed that, humans would stay the same and this technology would get better and we'd be displaced. But actually, all the evidence suggests that it changes the way we think. So there isn't some sort of stable balance between us and the machines. We adapt. So a simple example for me, I used to be able to. I've lived in Edinburgh for 30 years. And, it used to be the case that I could think, right, I want to go to this place, and I visualize where I was going in my head, and I would set off. But just because I turn the sat nav on every time I go somewhere in the car now, it's got to the point where I actually can't do that anymore. And I haven't suddenly lost that skill, but it's neglect and sort of each time I've not made that effort, that piece of my brain has become less utilized, has shrunk. And now I can't do it. And I think mindless use of AI does the same thing.
Tom, in the beginning of your paper, you talk about how our brains literally rewired when we learned to read. So you say 200 years ago, so only around 12% of the world's adults could read. Today it's about 87%. And we all look at that and we go, well, that's all about education, and that's amazing because it leads to different lives, leads to democracy, et cetera, all these things. But it wasn't really just about that. It was about our brains rewiring. And I'm really interested in this bit because I actually got some rows on social media about this recently, about whether if you read very fast, which I do, that affects your ability to recognize faces because it's the same part of the brain. And what you say here is that the connection between the hemispheres thickened. I'm not quite sure what that means. I'm going to leave you to explain that. But this intellectual shift led to a biological shift.
Yeah, that's right. And I find this fascinating because I think, certainly I had thought about, changing physiology as being a function of evolution. It happens across generations. But it was reading a book called The Weirdest People in the World that got me thinking about this. And
Yeah, we had the author of that on the podcast a while back. He was
it's
great.
it's a fascinating book.
Such a good book.
But he talks about this way that sort of culture hijacks your physiology and changes the way you think, and in particular, this learning the skill of reading and writing, it caused these changes in the brain. We repurpose this area of the brain that was used for recognizing faces, and there's a bit of a trade-off there. You do become less good at that, but in return you get this incredible skill, which is so useful. But it's just a really stark example of the way that you use technology, in that case writing, reshapes your physiology. And so we shouldn't, it is absolutely possible for a cultural technology to reach inside your skull and change the organ that makes you human.
Interesting, because we think that we tend to think that, as you say, that's evolutionary and it should take thousands and thousands of years. There should be generations of tiny little bits of change until the result appears. But this can happen in no time at all. And, reading spread quite slowly, right? Not everybody learned to read in a year, but everyone who can read now has access to AI immediately. So it's much faster, right? And what is it doing?
Yes, I think that's right. So I think what you can see is that you get this sort of these cultural changes operate in the same way that genetic changes work. So the three factors are variation, transmission, and selection. So if you think about, if you go back to the weirdest people in the world, the example there is the Catholic Church and how that controlled variation and ideas. It controlled transmission, the way ideas spread, and it controlled selection. Now, if you apply that to what's going on in the world today, AI, we can supercharge variation because the number of ideas that you can test, that you can generate, it grows exponentially, and ideas that humans just wouldn't have got to. It completely changes transmission of ideas. So, if 1 million children ask their parents, why is the sky blue, they'll get close to 1 million different answers. But because we're all started using 2 or 3 of these really dominant systems, everybody's getting some variation of the same answer. And yes, those systems are built on the whole corpus of human knowledge, but the centralization is incredible. You've changed the transmission mechanism for ideas, and then these AI algorithms that power media sites now completely control selection. Which ideas get amplified, which quietly disappear, and so we've allowed technology to dominate those 3 key vectors of cultural evolution: variation, transmission, selection.
Yeah. And you say as well that you now understand why Elon Musk bought Twitter.
At the time, it was challenging to understand the economic rationale. Now that we can debate whether that has changed subsequently. But when you think of it in terms of the impact that it has on cultural evolution and shaping ideas, you can see why that would be a valuable asset to somebody.
Interesting. Okay, so it sounds, when you put it like that, it sounds as though civilization itself will be transformed by these 3 things.
Well, I think that it does bring change, and the question to my mind is: are we going to passively and unthinkingly let this change happen, or do you have a debate about how these tools are used, where they're used? Do we passively accept our fate with this, or do we proactively seek to control it?
Okay, well, let's look at what happens when we allow it to happen passively, right? So one of the things you look at is this MIT study that looked at brains of participants while they wrote essays. So some of them wrote essays with absolutely no assistance at all. Some were able to use search engines and some were able to use AI assistance. And that was an experiment that showed us what will happen if we don't bring some focus into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you saw was that if you looked at what happened to people, if they were given AI, they would if essentially outsource the writing process. And the result was that about over 80% of that group that used AI to write the essay couldn't provide a single correct quote from the essay they had just written a few minutes earlier. So the effort that goes into the durable learning, that writing an essay, had just been bypassed entirely. And it's and that was completely different in the group that you searched, the group that wrote themselves. So if you just employ these tools to do something you would have otherwise done yourself, you will gradually lose the capability to do that. You will never develop the skill to do that. But if you engage positively with these systems, so you have the essay to write, you don't just say to the AI, write the essay, but you go and research the question using AI as a tool. I want to understand why this happened. I don't understand the relationship between factor A and factor B. You actually interact with it and think about the output and engage with it. Then you get the same results, cognitively, as if you just handwritten the essay. So it's that there's something about that effortful interaction, that seeking to gain knowledge, that is the crucial part in actually developing the cognitive skills. And if you passively let the AI do it, then it's not simply as bad as you never learn it, but actually you will start to mistake your ability to use AI tools with your mastery of the subject that you are trying, and so you will gain no knowledge or little knowledge and skill in the subject that you're focusing on. You'll just get better at using the AI, but you will confuse that with thinking that you're good at the actual topic.
Okay, so as you would put it, you've made a trade, but you haven't recognized that you've made that trade. You've traded efficiency, saving time, etc., and the result has been that your brain has become weaker, actively weaker. It's worse than it was.
Yeah, that's right. It's because you I think it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This sort of as you put more effort into something, if you are you don't know what you don't know effectively, and as you put more and more effort into it, you become more aware of how little you know of the topic. But you completely break that effect, that understanding of the limitations of your own knowledge, when you start using these tools, and that's the real weakness, the real interruption of the learning process.
And you end up without that base knowledge for yourself. And so that brings us to the world of work, and in fact the entire world, right? There's been so much talk about AI removing the bottom level of jobs. So AI can do the simple stuff. It can do anything an intern could do. It could do anything a junior could do. I mean, you can argue about whether it can and can't and the extent to which it makes mistakes. And we've done podcasts on that, of course. But for the moment, let's just take it as read that it is possible for AI to remove these lower levels of jobs. That then turns into a real problem, because if the next level up, if the job market starts at the next level up, that base knowledge is never embedded and created. You have to judge whether what your agent has told you is correct or not, but you no longer have the foundational skills to be able to do that.
Yep, absolutely right. So I think one way of thinking about this technology is that it's not a tide that lifts all boats. In some ways, you can think of it as a force multiplier. And what I mean by that is, if you are experienced in a topic and have a great deal of knowledge, then these tools can massively enhance your productivity. But the key part of it, as you highlight, is you have to be able to understand, interpret the output of these systems. And if you're a scientist who's never struggled through a statistical analysis manually, then you're probably not going to spot the results that are conceptually meaningless, that are being spat out by a machine. It's that prior mastery which allows you to genuinely evaluate what's coming out of these systems, rather than just giving it a superficial check. And so for those that have not gained the skills prior to using these tools, you don't have the ability to do that. You have there's a completely different power balance between the AI system and the human.
So a quote from your paper: the central paradox is this: AI reliably improves immediate task performance while degrading the underlying human capabilities that produce that performance. You get better results today but become less capable tomorrow. And you talk about that as well in terms of productivity, and that we get a productivity revolution up front while undermining the foundations of that productivity enhancement. So it can't continue indefinitely unless it's used in a different way.
Yeah, that's it. So you get this one-time benefit, if you like, that you have a workforce who's been through the effortful struggle to gain capability and knowledge and mastery, and then can use these tools. But unless you invest in the next generation and ensure that they have those skills, they don't simply use these tools or they don't simply oversee these tools, then they can never have that same relationship with them, and you don't get the same productivity benefit.
And then even worse, you get this confidence trap that you talk about as well. I mean, I was really struck, for which read absolutely horrified by a study you talk about from last year in the Lancet, which tracked endoscopists. How do you say that word?
Endoscopists, yeah.
Endoscopists. Words I can't even say. Look, here we are. I'm destroyed by AI already. And anyway, they went through periods of working with AI when they hadn't been working with AI, and the results were appalling.
Yeah, that's right. So you saw if you had these experienced practitioners using AI systems, and then after you took the AI systems away, there was one key indicator, for example, where the detection rate fell 21% with the same group before and after they'd had access to these AI tools. But then there was this, and I think this was probably the more worrying result, was that people tend to trust the output from the AI. And so when the experimenters went in and tweaked the AI to give confident but incorrect interpretations, what you saw was that human performance collapsed. So humans were much more likely to accept that the answer that they were being given was right, even though it was not.
Even when they were experienced and should know.
Even when they were experienced, yes.
Yeah, well,
So,
that's
and AI literacy was not sufficient to protect against that. So knowing that the tool is fallible did not prevent over-reliance.
Yeah, and we've seen this happen. I mean, these studies in the medical industry are really interesting, but we've seen this happen in real life in the legal industry, haven't we? We've seen lawyers actually on several occasions. In fact, we've had examples of this in Scotland, where I live. Seen lawyers actually relying on AI and producing false stuff, false quotes, false cases, false precedents.
Yeah, and it's back to this. If you get good results from the system, then you fall into this pattern of not questioning the output, and that's true of experienced professionals and it's a problem that only gets worse if people don't get that sort of underlying experience and understanding before they start using the tools.
Yeah. So we could end up in a position where most people do not have the foundational knowledge required to spot errors or to really see what is right and what is wrong. And even people with solid foundational knowledge can still fall into these traps where they don't use their foundational knowledge to spot mistakes.
Yep. And this is, this back to this sort of erosion of human skill, or changing the way that there just isn't this stable balance between us and the machines. It's, as you use these tools, as they become more and more effective, your relationship with them changes, and we have this tendency to when they confidently say things about the world, to accept it as true. We give them a false inappropriate amount of respect.
So what do we do?
Well, I think that I think there's a couple of things. So there is some evidence that in sort of expert domains, that if you use these tools deliberately, they can make you better. So one example of that was in the game Go, where AI famously beat a human player. But what you've seen subsequent to that sort of landmark event was that human players have learned from the AI. It's developed novel strategies, novel ways of going about the game, and you've seen an improvement in human performance. And you do see that result in sort of expert fields where these tools are used in a very deliberate way to be complementary to the human behavior. And so it's I think the key to it is, do you actually deliberately and thoughtfully engage with these systems, or do you just allow them to take over tasks that people are doing? And all the evidence suggests that if you don't really tightly control that, people will just let the machine do it, and human capability will atrophy.
Yeah. And the worry is that we are seeing that. I mean, the big conversation, of course, at the moment is around employment and about the disappearance of junior jobs, which we talked about just now. But that's not theoretical. That's happening. And you write about that in this paper as well, about the hollowing out of white collar professions. So it looks like we are already taking the wrong path here, in that we should have just as many junior lawyers, accountants, doctors, customer services people, whatever it is. We should have as many as we had before for the knowledge building.
Well, I think that's the real challenge, right? Because people look at this technology and say it can allow me to reduce costs, and I can I don't have to hire junior people. I don't have to train them. I can use these systems, but and there's real pressure to do that. But I just think that is a very dangerous path to go down. So I think there's real value in having humans learning to do these tasks, in whichever white collar profession and having them do it without access to these systems, and so that you then retain that ability to override these systems when they're not producing the right answers. But you have to invest in the human capital first. So I guess the analogy would be with pilots. Pilots still have to learn to fly manually before they can learn to use autopilot, because if the autopilot at some point fails, they need to be there to land the plane.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why everyone has a bias towards older pilots, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I got on an airplane and I see that the pilots are kind of maybe over 45 or better still over 50, I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled, because I know that it means that they've got a strong base of knowledge about how to actually fly a plane, because they probably had to do it for a good while without autopilot before now.
Absolutely, and it applies. And an accountant who's prepared hundreds of tax returns by hand can spot the error in an AI generated filing. The AI, the doctor who's made the diagnoses without AI can override the confident but wrong prediction in the right circumstances, with the right support. And so I think what that says to me is that you professional bodies, universities, employers, they need to preserve those training pathways to building expertise, even when the AI makes that look slow and inefficient, because you're not going to be able to orchestrate the AI.
Yeah, tough sell to people trying to cut costs. And a tough sell in a world where let's say you're the company who says, I have to preserve this and I'm going to keep hiring and we're going to learn this properly and then we'll use AI later. And your competitors are saying, sod that, we're going to fire everybody down at the bottom, or certainly not hire anymore, and our costs will be lower and our margins will be higher. And as you say, that's going to be a bit like a sugar rush, right? That'll work for a certain period and then it won't work anymore. But that transition period of learning how we work with AI is going to be tricky for a lot of people and a lot of companies.
I think so. And the challenge with it comes that it's happening so fast. It's in previous transitions, you've had time to work through these issues, and the challenge here is that we don't have a lot of time because this is coming at us so quickly. But it's I do think as the way the Scottish mortgage investors over really long time periods, and it's it, there isn't a great deal of value in something that benefits the next handful of years at the expense of all future years. And so I think what you have a question of time horizon here. It's, yes, you can save money in the short run, but if it's going to have a real long-term cost to your ability to operate your business, then that's a false economy.
Okay, so let's think about what we can do both as individuals and as companies. If you are a young person entering the workforce today, what do you need to do? What are the skills you need to acquire, and how do you need to look at your employment? I mean, I know there is one path to take, which is simply to say I'm not getting involved in this, and I'm going into a craft. I'm going into roofing or stone carving, or we have a huge shortage, by the way, of craftsmen in the UK. So this is a fantastic thing if people are decide to make their choice in that direction as well. But nonetheless, that's not going to absorb 1 million kids a year. What else? How do you look at your path as a young person?
Well, I guess the way I frame it is, the people who will thrive are not those who use AI the most, but those who can still think without it. And so I guess the message is, don't take the easy path. Don't take the shortcuts to productivity that these tools give you. It's putting in the hard yards. It's doing the things that you don't want to do, that effortful struggle, and generate, build, investing in yourself and your own capabilities. That will be most important over the long run.
And at the company level, so that's individuals. But what does a company need to do? I think we've slightly come up with the answer to that. They need to keep paying up to make sure that their employees have a base of knowledge and skill. Beyond that,
well, I do think it's really hard, because you have this this constant battle for survival in the corporate world. You have to be cost effective, but if it seems to me very short-sighted if you allow the current generation of experienced professionals to get a huge productivity bump from these tools, but you don't think about how you replace them. How the next set of the next generation of professionals will actually operate. Because we can all see the flaws in these tools. A deep understanding of how they work, and ability to, there's a whole set of cognitive skills which will be necessary for the next generation, which weren't necessary for our generation. The ability to orchestrate these tools, the ability to break down tasks in such a way that you can use these tools to answer the sub questions and recompose that information. There's a whole set of different cognitive abilities which are necessary to use these tools effectively, but don't neglect the basics, the fundamental understanding of the job that you're trying to do, and the ability to solve problems, and investing in people with the capability to do that, because otherwise it's a false productivity game.
and what about investment implications?
Honestly, I don't really think that there is a particular investment implication from this. I went into it because it was something I was interested in. I was interested in how it was affecting me. I was thinking about what it means for my kids. I think that the sort of narrower investment standpoint, it is this really tricky balance between driving productivity and making sure you have the capabilities for the future. I wouldn't extend it beyond that, because in a way it's the inverse. It's the gains that people are making today are coming at the expense of people. So that's it's not something that from just my cold investment hard-nosed sort of view of the world that you can really take into account.
Yeah. How nervous does it make you? Because if I think people listening to this conversation will come out of the other end thinking to themselves that it's almost a given that the majority of people will use AI passively in the dangerous way that you have suggested, that this will be the default. This is what most people will do. And there will be a small group of people who will not, and who will engage with it in the other way that you suggested, using it as an assistance, a learning tool with which they engage but still think for themselves. So it rather sounds as though that leads us into a world of very, very unequal outcomes, even more so than the world we live in now.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree with you. So, and that's come back to the title of the paper. AI isn't coming for your job; it's coming for your mind. If you passively accept that outcome, then the question is, well, what job are you suitable for in this world where there's some set of activities, and I think a useful model for this is don't think of AI replacing jobs. Think of AI replacing tasks. And a job is composed of multiple tasks. Now it's AI will replace humans doing some of those tasks. So that is inevitable. But it's like what's your worth as a human worker? Well, it sort of depends what you've let AI do to your mind. But I think that to your inequality point, if you take the example of Meta, the owners of Facebook. It was last summer that they were going. They went through this hiring spree for their super intelligence, their AI systems unit, and the rumors were that they were paying individuals hundreds of millions of dollars to come and do this, and the rationale was that you're spending billions of dollars on these systems. What you want is a small group of engineers who can really keep that whole system in their head, and even if you're paying them hundreds of millions of dollars, that sort of is dwarfed by the amount that you're spending on the hardware. So within that company, you suddenly get this big discrepancy, this big inequality between those small number of individuals and the engineers across the rest of the firm. But what you also see is that in other parts of the business, you're reducing the number of people because you're getting efficiency from using these tools, and so you're laying off people. And so you go from this world where there was greater equality in the workforce and what people were getting paid to suddenly you're paying people hundreds of millions of dollars and firing people at the same time, and you get that within a single company. But then you start to get that across companies. Which are the ones that have been able to adopt these tools and embrace them and win competitively, and so you get the inequality between companies. And then it's between countries as well, because whose AI are we using? In the UK, we're mostly using AI systems from the US and from China, and cheap power then becomes another really important factor in that, and we have very expensive power. So you can see these fault lines of inequality widening rapidly.
Yeah. Final thought. Kids going to university these days. We talk about this a lot on the podcast because of the extraordinary cost of student loans and the handicap that gives you once you leave effectively paying 9 percentage points of extra income tax every year, etc. And the question now is, are you learning anything valuable at university? And I hear more and more from students that their exams are at home, open book, 24 hours, etc. And a lot of them will then use AI for that, I'm sure, which sounds like it makes the entire university experience not just pointless, but worse than pointless. So it's only worth going at all if you engage with your learning in the way that we've just discussed. So for an awful lot of people, this may be a pointless expense.
I think that's a real risk. I'd say my point of optimism on this is, I think if you look back through some of these previous technological waves, if you take social media, again, for our generation, we were hopeless users of those systems initially, and people made all sorts of faux pas, etc. But then the next generation who'd grown up with those tools, were very, very smart at how to use them and didn't encounter the same sort of set of issues. They were native, they were digitally native. And, I observe similar pattern with AI technology in my own children. I used to worry about, are they doing exactly what you said? Are they taking their schoolwork and just outsourcing it? But I actually see them using these tools to not because I'm leaning on them the whole time, but I'm just watching what they do, and they don't sort of outsource the tasks. They're actually, these are fantastic tools for learning if you use them appropriately. And so, it's back to that sort of personal responsibility point. Yes, you can go and, skive your way through university and outsource all the learning and, end up with lots
come
of
out with your
debt.
worthless 2-1.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Or you can have a very different experience, and you want to you want to have a much better experience because effectively you have an always on, infinitely patient tutor who can answer your every question. It
Sometimes incorrectly.
But I do think that you have to learn how to think fundamentally. To be employable, you have to be able to think for yourself.
Yeah.
And that's what you need to go to university to learn to do.
Okay. There we go. There's your takeaway, everyone. Keep learning to think for yourself. Tom, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And just to repeat to everybody, we will put the link in the show notes so you can go and read this for yourself. It's really, really interesting. Tom, thank you.
Thanks, Merryn, for having me.